Hey guys, welcome from Jeff City. Had an exciting day today at Yig. It's late and I am tired, so let's go ahead and get right into it. Today we have an awfully cheery topic to talk about: slavery. Hooray! Good way to end the week, right on Friday, talking about slavery. So, we're going to combine a couple things here today. We'll talk a little bit about slavery. We'll talk about the abolitionist movement, which probably we could have done last unit with the antebellum reformers, but it fits a little bit better here on the road to civil war. So we've already talked about the cotton gin a little bit, right? In terms of the market revolution and how it helped affect the market revolution. But the cotton gin is going to have sort of bigger implications. Well, the market revolution and, of course, slavery. Because the cotton gin is going to make slavery even more profitable. So after the cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney, Southern planters basically are going to double down because now they can produce even more. That combined with the market revolution, with all the textile mills from Slater and his doing that are going on in North, and particularly in England. England is going to be a mass buyer of Southern cotton. So the cotton gin is going to have an awfully big impact, not only on the economy, but with obviously the institution of slavery. So, like we talked about, both the North and the South relied on cotton because of the textile mills up in the North required the raw material, and obviously the South had essentially become a non-diversified economy where they're really only growing one crop, mostly cotton. So it's going to be an important crop for both the North and the South. And as you can see here, that the world or the South produces basically half of the world's supply of cotton. That's why we call it King Cotton. Down in the South in that black belt area of the country where the soil is so rich and dark that it's almost black, which is why we call it the black belt. And as I mentioned, Britain is going to be one of the main buyers of the South's cotton, so much so that Britain will actually contemplate coming in as an ally of the South once we get to the Civil War, but that of course is next unit. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves there. But obviously cotton and slavery sort of go hand in hand, right? You have the slaves working the fields, picking the cotton, and the cotton gin, which allows to separate the seeds from the cotton, will allow this industry and the institution of slavery to take off. So here's a nice little graphic so you can see really the effect that the cotton gin is going to have. You can see by 1860 the amount of cotton produced in the United States in just about 20 years almost triples, or close to triples, and the amount of slaves, as you can see, goes up by 1.5 million slaves as a result of this. So you can sort of see the progression that we're getting here to, and the results, the actual effects of the cotton gin. Here again, you can see that with the reliance of cotton. So in the 1800s, cotton really isn't that big of a deal, but 60 years later, we got almost 60% of all exports are cotton. So this speaks towards the fact that the South isn't really diversifying at all. They're relying on one crop, which is going to make the need for slaves that more important. This isn't like the colonial age where you have some places growing tobacco, other places growing sort of barley grains. Basically, every plantation is growing cotton at this point, and that, or close to every. Don't want to hyperbolize, but you have a vast majority of plantations growing mainly cotton, and you can see that here with this graphic. So this is going to create almost like an oligarchy in the South, where the South and its structure, its society, and its power politically is going to rest with this planter elite, these big plantation owners who own many slaves. So they lived in big mansions, big plantations. Their children are sort of also part of this higher element of society, getting private schooling. Remember that we have Horace Mann working through part of this time to introduce public schooling. But before that really becomes widespread, these planter elites are still going to have the money from all of their successful growing to send their children to private schools. So that will be sort of an important aspect of this. And this is sort of interesting because this planter elite is really not going to go away. Even after the Civil War, this planter aristocracy is going to stay in place in the South, and they're really never going to renounce their ways on slavery because their structure and their success and really their station in society depends so much on slavery that they really are going to fight literally to the death to keep it. And so you can sort of see this melding of economic success and social success, where not only are they obviously benefited from slavery by financially, but politically as well, because they turn into really the ruling class of the South, where you have the few really exercising their power over the many. And this is something that Andrew Jackson doesn't really like, and this sort of is really sort of anti-democratic to a certain extent, with the few sort of elite ruling over the many, over the poor. So this is going to add to that sort of dynamic. So you can see here that with the slave-owning families, it's not, the big sort of massive people who own 100 or more slaves. You can see there aren't very many. And that sort of top of the graph here, those 1,733 owners who own more than 100 slaves or more, that's going to be sort of the planter elite that we're sort of talking about. So you can see here that the vast majority of the South probably owns 1 to about 10 slaves. So you see 100,000 there with 2 to 4, 68,000 with 1, 80,000 from 5 to 9. So really the majority of the South are not these massive plantations that have all these slaves, like the Grimke family, for example. Most of them are just sort of more modest owners of maybe just 1 or 2 slaves. But that makes sense because, of course, slaves are expensive. Now, they of course are property at this time, legally speaking, and you don't have to pay them labor like you would, say, an employee, but at the same time you do have to pay a pretty substantial down payment, an initial payment to acquire the slaves. So that's why you're going to see maybe most families have enough to buy 1, maybe 2 or 3, but only the social elite, sort of those planting aristocrats that we just talked about, are going to have enough to own more than 100 slaves. And that's that little top bit there is what we're talking about really when we're talking about these planter elites, these aristocrats. So this, of course, is not very good idea, right? You always talk about, like, these days when you're talking about your financial portfolio, you want to make sure you're diversified, because if you're overly invested in one stock and that stock tanks, well, then you're in pretty big trouble, right? So that's really what is going to make the South and their fighting for slavery so fierce, because they are over dependent on one crop. They're over dependent on slaves because of that. Because cotton is a very sort of time intensive crop to harvest. You have to pick it, you have to then run it through the cotton gin, and all the different steps that you have to get to be able to turn it into cotton, into string or yarn or whatever it is that you'll be able to make it into clothes, is a pretty intensive process. And so this fact that it's just one crop is going to sort of make this dependence on slavery almost absolute, which is why the South is so unwilling to get rid of it as we move towards the Civil War. And the other thing is that you're sort of at the mercy of the world economy, because all you have to sell is cotton. So if the prices of cotton drops, or the ability of your trade partners to buy this cotton is compromised in any way, then it's going to mean a serious sort of financial risk. It's going to mean a serious depression in your economy. And This also, like I said, we're talking about diversification, is going to discourage diversification in agriculture and really manufacturing, because if you are really good at one thing, right, you want to play to your strengths. And, well, the South is really good at growing cotton. The North is going to become really good at making textile mills. So we're really, the whole economy, almost to a certain extent, is going to have this reliance on this one crop. But the prices of slaves are also going to, and like I said, there's this interconnection between cotton and slaves, obviously. And the more worthwhile cotton becomes, the more worthwhile slaves become, the more expensive they become. Because the price of slaves will continue to rise, and all of the investments that went towards those slaves and expenses and other investments are going to rise as well. So we sort of get this system in the South that is very, very dependent on slavery. And if you take away slaves, as you can see, you can sort of think about what the world would, or the United States would become like. We have an overdependence on one crop, which requires slaves. We have an industrial complex in the North that requires on the raw materials that those slaves are producing. So you can sort of see why, for a certain time at least, the North is going to be a little bit more reluctant to sort of fully get behind this abolitionist movement. All right. So when we were talking about the market revolution, we talked about how we got the large-scale immigration, either from Ireland because of the potato famine, or Germany because of the depression that they have there. But these immigrants are not coming to the South. They're coming to the North. So this, of course, is gonna be somewhat significant, right? Remember, we're keeping an eye out towards the Civil War. We're on the road towards the Civil War right now. And if we're talking about immigrants coming into the country, well, one of the major advantages the North is going to have in the Civil War is going to be population. And part of the reason they're going to have such a huge population advantage was, one, slaves, right? You don't really think, if you're a Southern slave owner, you want to put a gun in a slave's hand and say you're going to fight, do you? So you have 4 million people in the South who straight up just won't fight. But then you also get massive amounts of immigrants coming into the North, buoying their population, buoying their manpower and their wealth. So the North is going to benefit from this. And the South, well, it just wasn't an attractive place for immigrants. Where are they going to get jobs in the South? Really. I mean, plantation owners have shown that they're more likely to buy a slave than hire employees to a certain extent. So, you have to compete with slave labor in terms of getting jobs. And down there, because of most of the land has been eaten up by these big plantation and farmers, you're not going to be able to get a lot of easy land, or at least cost-effective land. And of course, Europeans don't know that much about growing cotton. It's not like they have a good cotton market over there. If they did, Britain wouldn't be so dependent on the South to require the cotton. So it's not like they have some pre-loaded skills or anything like that with regards to cotton. So by the time we get to 1860, we're going to see 3/4 of the total population did not actually own slaves. So that's an interesting bit, because particularly when you see that graph that we saw before, that sort of is sort of a surprising statistic. All right, sort of running out of time here on this 15-minute block, so we'll try to get through this next slide here in a minute or so. So in the North, as we sort of asked and answered in one of the reading quizzes, the abolitionists are for sort of freeing the slaves, but no one really is sure what it would be like to have both blacks and whites sort of coexisting in the same society. That's a big question mark. And Southerners who were raised by black nurses liked individual blacks, but really didn't hate the race, or hated the race as a whole. So they may be like their caretaker or their nurse, but as a whole really had racism and hatred in their hearts. And we see in the North, they're a little skeptical, like we sort of had talked about before. They claim that they liked the race, but hated sort of individual African Americans. And they're going to be major safe havens in the North, parts of the Underground Railroad. We talked about that the other day, how Rochester up in New York sort of becomes the end line of the Underground Railroad, and because of that, there are going to be a lot of free African Americans in the North. So, it says here we have about 200,000 free African Americans in the North.